Some secrets are not buried in the ground. They are pressed between pages, folded inside linen, hidden within walls, waiting with the patience of stone for someone brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough to search for them. In the spring of 1923, a group of workers repairing an old plantation house in Claiborne County, Mississippi, came across something that made them pause. It was not a body, not a weapon, but something far more unsettling than either. Wrapped carefully in oilcloth behind a false panel in the study wall, they pulled out a leather-bound book. Its pages were brown and brittle, and the ink had faded to the color of dried mud. It was a diary dated from 1851 through 1857, and it appeared to be written by two different hands. By nightfall, the foreman had already sent word to the county historical office. By the following week, 3 people who had read the contents reportedly refused to speak about what they had seen. One of them is said to have described it simply as the most honest account of evil I have ever read. This is the story of what was written inside that diary and what it revealed about the Harrove family, the plantation they called Belmont, and the hidden world that existed just beneath the surface of everything the county had always believed to be respectable. Stay with this, because what happened inside that large house is far stranger and far more disturbing than anyone living nearby ever suspected. Before we continue with the story of the Harrove family and Belmont Plantation, if this is your first time here, welcome to this channel. We share stories like this one, real, dark, and rooted in the buried corners of American history. Subscribe and press the notification bell so you never miss a story. And while you settle in, tell us in the comments where you are listening from, what city and what state. We enjoy knowing who is here with us as we move through these stories together. Now let us open the diary. To understand what was hidden in the diary, you must first understand Belmont. The plantation sat on about 340 acres of flat alluvial land in Claiborne County, Mississippi. It was a wide, humid part of the state where the soil ran so black and rich it almost seemed alive, and the summer heat rested over the fields like a heavy living weight. The county was established in 1802, and by the 1840s it had become one of the most productive cotton-producing regions in the entire South. The town of Port Gibson stood nearby, Woodgate, a quiet and civilized community with church spires and brick storefronts, and a population that took pride in its manners, its church attendance, and its quiet discretion about matters it preferred not to discuss openly. Belmont was not the largest plantation in Claiborne County, but it was considered among the most successful. The Big House, as it was called, by everyone, both enslaved and free, stood at the end of a long road lined with live oak trees. Their branches were draped with Spanish moss that moved in the hot breeze like something half alive. The house itself was built in the Greek Revival style, 2 stories of whitewashed brick, 4 columns across the front, a wide gallery along the second floor, and shuttered windows that stayed closed through the hottest months to keep out the sun and the flies. It was the type of house meant to be seen, designed to signal permanence, stability, and control. The Hargrove family had owned Belmont since 1823, when a man named Hezekiah Hargrove arrived from South Carolina with 2 wagons, a letter of credit, and 23 enslaved people. He purchased the land from a speculator who had never even attempted to build on it. Hezekiah was, by most accounts of the time, a capable and ruthless man, not unusually cruel by the standards of that era, which is to say he was cruel enough, and he surrounded himself with people willing to be even crueler, so that the plantation ran smoothly and the cotton bales stacked up year after year. He built the Big House in 1827. Over the following decade he added the other structures in stages: the kitchen, the smokehouse, and the slave quarters. By the time Hezekiah died in 1844, Belmont was producing more than 200 bales of cotton every year, and his son Edmund Hargrove inherited everything. Edmund was 31 years old when his father died, and he had grown up in that house, in that county, under the shadow of everything his father had built. He had attended the College of Louisiana for a short time before his father called him home. He had a wife, Catherine Nye Leland, from Natchez, whom he had married in 1839. By 1844, they already had 2 children, a boy named Harlan who was 4 years old, and a daughter, Adelaide, who was 2. By most descriptions, Edmund was neither the worst man nor the best. He existed somewhere in the middle of the moral spectrum, the way men in positions of absolute authority often do, not forced to think very deeply about the distance between who they believed themselves to be and what they actually allowed. He was, however, a man of routine, and one of his habits, somewhat unusual for a planter of his time, was keeping a journal. He had kept one since his college days, writing observations about weather, crop yields, business transactions, and sometimes personal thoughts in a tight and careful hand. When he returned to Belmont, after his father's death, he continued this practice. He noted the price of cotton in New Orleans. He wrote about a drought during the summer of 1845 that cost him, by his estimate, 14 bales. He recorded the birth of his third child, a daughter named Clariara, born in 1846 and dead of fever before she reached her first birthday. He wrote about a disagreement with his cotton factor in Vicksburg. He wrote about the weather. What he did not write about, or mentioned only in the most controlled and formal language, was what was actually happening at Belmont. The journal he kept was the journal of a man constructing a record, not confessing to one, but someone else was confessing, and that is where the second hand enters the story. The workers who discovered the diary in 1923 first assumed it belonged entirely to Edmund Hargrove. His name was written on the inside cover, in the same careful writing that filled the first several dozen pages. But as the county historical worker, a woman named Mrs. Edna Farrar, who had some experience with document preservation, slowly turned the pages, she noticed that the handwriting changed. Not gradually, but suddenly. It began partway through an entry dated March 14, 1851, where Edmund had been writing about a broken cotton gin and the cost of repairs. The entry stopped in the middle of a sentence, literally mid-sentence. The cost of the repair from Vicksburg will amount to no less than 30, and then nothing. A blank line, and below it, in a different hand, smaller and more hesitant, with letters formed differently and a tendency to press harder on certain words, as if emphasizing them through pressure alone, appeared the following words: "My name is not writ 10 here because it cannot be safely written. But I will say that I have lived at Belmont since I was 9 years old, and I am now past 30. I have seen enough, I know enough, and since no one will ever ask me what I know, I will write it here instead, in the only place I can put words that will not be taken from me immediately. If you are reading this, whoever you are, then something has changed. Either I am gone or the world is different enough that this can be known. Either way, I want you to know what happened here." Mrs. Farrar reportedly read those lines 3 times before turning the page. The second hand belonged to a woman. This became clear almost immediately from the context inside the writing. She referred to herself indirectly but clearly as a woman, and as the person responsible for the domestic management of the big house. She was enslaved. She had access to Edmund Hargrove's journal, which in itself was remarkable, and she explained it plainly in her second entry. She had learned to read and write at the age of 9, secretly taught by the previous mistress of the house before that woman died. She had kept this knowledge hidden for more than 20 years. Edmund Hargrove did not know that the woman who cleaned his study, prepared his fire, and dusted the shelves of his books could read every word he wrote. She signed each of her entries only with the letter R. She never wrote her full name. She explained this clearly in the first entry. "If this is ever found before the time is right, I will not have my name used against the people I have tried to protect. R is enough. R is me. R has always been enough." During the investigation in the 1920s and the academic studies that followed in later decades, historians were never able to definitively prove who R was. The plantation records from Belmont included a ledger kept by Edmund Hargrove, listing the enslaved people there, with ages, descriptions, and assigned work. Among them was a woman named Ruth, about 35 years old in 1851, described as the housekeeper and noted as having been at Belmont since about 1824. She would have been a child of roughly 9 years old. in 1824, the same year the previous mistress of the house, Hezekiah Hargrove's wife, died of consumption. Most historians who study the diary believe that Ruth may have been R, but they have never been completely certain because R was careful, extremely careful. The care she showed, the way she moved through that diary, revealing things slowly, layer by layer, never saying more than she had to, always holding something back, suggests a woman who had survived a very long time in a very dangerous place by knowing exactly when to speak and when to remain silent. To understand the diary, you must read it for what it truly is. Two records of the same place written by two people with completely different access to the truth. Edmund's entries, which continue throughout the diary mixed between ours, describe Belmont from above. He writes about production, about labor assignments, about the cost of supplies from Port Gibson. He writes about his children with a warm and slightly performative affection that almost feels written for an audience. He writes about Catherine, his wife, only occasionally, mostly in passing, and usually in relation to household matters. In April of 1851, he records that he has hired a new overseer, a man named Denton Rook, who came recommended by a planter in Jefferson County. He describes Rook in a single short sentence: a capable man, firm but fair. That sentence, firm but fair, is one of the most frequently recorded phrases in the diary, because of what R later wrote about Rook beginning about a week afterward. "He is not fair," she wrote. "He has been here 6 days. In 6 days, I have already seen 3 things that I will not put on paper, because to write them would mean carrying them inside my body every time I read these pages again. But I will say this: the man Hargrove hired is a different kind of trouble than what we have had before. The earlier man, Stokes, was brutal in a direct way. You knew what he would do and when he would do it and why. This one is different. This one smiles. This one has a way of speaking to Mr. Hargrove that makes Mr. Hargrove believe whatever he wishes to believe. And the things this man does, the things I cannot write about, he does them quietly. Then he stands at the supper table and calmly talks about cotton prices in a steady voice. And I watch Mr. Hargrove nod and think he is getting good value for his wages. Mr. Hargrove is not a foolish man, but he has decided, I think, that there are things he prefers not to know. And a man who has chosen not to know something can sometimes be more dangerous than a man who simply does not know. This passage was shared widely among historians after the diary was first closely examined in the late 1940s. It is considered by many scholars of antebellum history to be one of the most psychologically accurate observations about the complicity of plantation owners that appears in any surviving document from that time. But the diary had much more to reveal than the figure of Denton Rook. What Edmund truly did not know, or what he had buried so deeply inside deliberate ignorance that it became almost the same thing, was the inner life of his own house. He did not know that the woman who managed his domestic affairs had been reading his journal for years. He did not know that she had been writing in the margins and blank spaces of that same journal everything she had witnessed. He did not know that the women who cooked his meals and cleaned his rooms and helped raise his child had built over many years a careful and detailed knowledge of every person in the house, every secret, every fear, every weakness, every quiet arrangement that was never meant to be spoken aloud. He did not know, above all, that the most important thing he believed he owned, the calm and prosperous image that Belmont presented to the county, was maintained almost entirely by the intelligence and labor of people he had never once invited to speak. The big house at Belmont had 11 rooms on the main floors and 3 rooms in the attic that we used for storage, and during busy seasons, sometimes for sleeping. The basement served as a root cellar, and also R notes this with a flat tone that suggests she felt it did not even deserve comment, as a place where people were sometimes confined. The domestic staff who worked inside the house at any given time numbered between 4 and 7 people depending on the season and the needs of the household. Among them, R identifies several by name in her diary entries. Using the names she clearly knew those individuals used among themselves. Not always the names recorded in Edmund's ledger. There was a woman she calls Dear, who was the cook, middle-aged, with a burn scar on her right forearm from a kitchen accident years earlier, and a memory for recipes, remedies, and faces that R describes as remarkable. Dear knows things about this family that the family does not know about itself. R wrote in one entry, "She has cooked for them for 20 years. She has watched every one of them eat. She knows who sleeps poorly and who sleeps well, who drinks more than they admit, who cries in the morning, and who does not cry at all." There was a young man R calls Thomas, perhaps 18 or 19 in 1851, who worked mostly inside the house doing heavy tasks and serving at the table. R's entries about Thomas carry a special care, a gentle finesse. She allows herself almost nowhere else in the diary. She describes him as quick, observant, and holding an anger that he managed with enormous discipline. She notes that Thomas could read numbers, though not letters, and that he had a gift for calculating things in his head, cotton weights, distances, times, numbers that several of the white men on the plantation could not match, and had quietly learned. Not to mention, there was also a girl R calls Nance, perhaps 12 or 13, young enough that R writes about her with something very close to dread. "Nance is not yet grown," she writes, "and the house is not a safe place for a girl who is not yet grown. And I am doing what I can, and it is not enough, and I know it is not enough. And I am writing this down because writing it is the only thing I can do that does not destroy me completely. This passage, and the several that follow it, always indirect, always controlled, never stating openly what she means but never leaving the reader uncertain, represent what historians have described as the most difficult section of the diary to read. Not because R uses violent language, she does not, but because of what she refuses to say. Because of the silence around the words, the careful avoidance of direct description that somehow becomes more devastating than description itself. R writes about Nance with the awareness of a woman who understood exactly what the girl was being moved toward and could not stop it, but could witness it and refuse to let the witness it be erased. That refusal to allow things to disappear is the driving force of the entire diary. Catherine Hargrove, Edmund's wife, appears in R's diary more often than in Edmund's own entries, which is itself revealing. Edmund mentions Catherine only in passing, as a presence, as the manager of household accounts, sometimes as the source of a request he considers unreasonable and then grants anyway. He does not describe her in any depth. He never writes about her inner life at all. Does. R's portrait of Catherine Hargrove is one of the most complex in the diary. Complicated, unsparing, and marked by something that resists easy judgment. R does not sympathize with Catherine in any simple way, but she does not dismiss her either. She writes about Catherine as a woman trapped in a system she had not designed and could not escape, who had nonetheless found ways to use that system that made her complicit in its cruelty, and who had also, in small and almost invisible ways, sometimes pushed against it. Mrs. Hargrove is not a cruel woman, R wrote in an entry from June 1851. She is something harder to name than cruel. She is a woman who knows, I think, more than she admits she knows, and who has learned that knowing and speaking are very different things. She sees what happens here, some of it. She sees enough, and she does not speak. I have watched her face when certain things are done in her sight, and there is something there, something that flinches, something that turns away, and then she puts her face back together and continues with her day. I do not know if I should hate her for that, or understand it. Maybe both. Maybe neither. I have been watching her for 15 years, and I still do not know. In later entries, the relationship between Catherine and R becomes more clearly important. R describes a series of conversations, always held in low voices, always in rooms where they would not be overheard, in which Catherine asked R questions that R believed were not casual. Questions about what happened in the quarters. Questions about what happened in the quarters. Questions about certain people. Questions whose answers Catherine seemed somehow already to know. She is asking me things, R writes in September 1851. and I do not yet know what she plans to do with what I tell her. There are two possibilities. One of them ends badly for everyone. The other one, I can barely allow myself to think about the other one, but I am answering her carefully, a little at a time, because something has changed in her. Something shifted after Rook came, and I think, though I am not certain, that she may have seen something she cannot return to the place of not knowing. What Catherine had seen, R reveals in the following entry, was something she had witnessed from an upstairs window of the big house, an incident in the fields involving Denton Rook that she had watched from a distance and about which she had not yet spoken to her husband. R knew this because Catherine had come to her within an hour of seeing it and sat down in the kitchen without speaking for a long time before saying anything at all. She did not describe what she saw, R writes. She did not have to. I knew what she had seen. I had known for months. And the way she sat in that kitchen, very still and very pale, and then looked up at me with those eyes, I understood something. She had believed before that moment that there were limits, that there were things that simply did not happen here, that whatever the outside world might be, Belmont was a certain kind of place. And now she knew that Belmont was not that kind of place at all. It had never been that kind of place. It had only been very good at looking like one. If this story is already getting under your skin, you are not alone. Thousands of people have listened to stories like this on this channel, and the comments are always the most interesting part. What do you think is written in that diary so far? What do you think Catherine is going to do? Leave your theory in the comments, and if you have not already, a like on this video helps more people discover stories like this one. Now, let us continue. A large part of the diary one-third of Art's total entries concerns Denton Rook. Rook was from somewhere in northern Mississippi and had a long enough record as an overseer that he arrived with references which Edmund checked and found acceptable. He was about 40 years old in 1851, a lean man with close-set eyes, and an unhurried manner that the planters who wrote about him in their letters and records, several of which appeared later, often described as professional. He knew how to speak to men of Edmund's class without appearing overly eager. He knew when to talk and when to remain silent. He understood what was expected of him and delivered it efficiently. He was also, as R records with careful and precise detail across dozens of entries, something far more disturbing than simply cruel. What made Rook extraordinary in the darkest possible sense was the way he understood and exploited the internal social structure of the plantation's enslaved community. He was not just a man who used violence as a tool of control. He was a man who used information. He learned who was close to whom, who trusted whom, who feared whom. He identified the relationships that mattered, the partnerships, the kinships, the quiet arrangements people had built in order to survive. And he applied pressure to those relationships with a precision that R found and described as something completely different from anything she had seen before. The man before Rook, she writes, Stokes, was a blunt instrument. He was exactly what he appeared to be. He made no effort to pretend otherwise. Rook is an architect. He builds things. He constructs. He looks at a group of people and sees structure. Who holds it up? Where the weight lies, where to place a hand to make the entire structure shift in whatever direction he wants. I have watched him for 4 months now, she writes, and I understand something about him that I do not think Mr. Hargrove understands, and that I am not certain Rook himself could explain if someone asked him. He does not do what he does out of hatred. He does these things because it interests him, because it is the kind of problem he enjoys figuring out. And a man who hurts others because he hates them will eventually stop once his hatred feels satisfied. But a man who harms people because it is a puzzle he likes solving will never truly stop. There will always be another puzzle waiting. This understanding, this recognition of Rook's mind and behavior, is what gives R's diary its unique character. She was not only writing down events as they happened, she was thinking deeply about them. She was slowly building a picture of the man she was observing, and she was doing this with a level of accuracy and thought that is remarkable in any record from any time, and even more extraordinary in a diary written secretly by a woman living under such dangerous circumstances. She was also, as becomes clear as the diary continues. Doing something with the knowledge she was gathering, the diary slowly begins to change in tone around November of 1851. Ra's entries become shorter, sharper, with less of the deep personal reflection that filled her earlier pages and more of something like coded reporting. Events are written briefly, sometimes in shortened words that suggest she was writing quickly and carefully, fully aware of the danger she faced. Each time she opened the book, every time she wrote, something was quietly being organized. R never states this openly. She never directly says what she and the people around her were working on. But the steady build-up of small details makes the truth clear. She writes about quiet talks with Dia in the kitchen that stop the moment a certain person walks past the door. She writes about Thomas being given an errand that sends him to Port Gibson, and she carefully notes that he returned carrying certain information about a matter she never clearly names. She writes about a man in the quarters of the field workers. She refers to him only as P. A man she describes as someone everyone listened to, the kind of person who moved quietly through the world, yet whose quiet movements slowly changed the direction of things around him. I told P what I know, she writes in December 1851. All of it, or as much as I have been able to write down. He did not speak for a long time after I finished talking. When he finally spoke, he said, "We must know everything before we can do anything. That is right. That is the only right path." And I told him I was still working on it. And he looked at me in the way a man looks at you when he has understood something about you for a long time, something you have only just begun to understand about yourself. And he said, "I know you are. What exactly were they working toward?" This question later troubled every historian who carefully studied the diary. And the answer, when it slowly appears over many more months of entries through the long winter of 1851 and into the spring and summer of 1852, is not what anyone first expected. They were not mainly planning an escape, although the diary includes several careful mentions of people who had already escaped, their names written with caution and with a deliberate lack of detail, as if even the absence of description was meant to protect them. The greater plan that R slowly describes was not really about leaving Belmont. It was about recording it. R explains this most clearly in one of her most direct entries, dated March 3rd, 1852, written with a clarity that suggests she had been thinking about how to say this for a very long time. "What I have finally understood is that the only thing that can outlast us is a record. Bodies are buried in the ground, and the ground forgets them. Words can be burned, and mouths can be silenced, and names can slowly disappear, one by one, until nothing remains to prove that any person was ever here, that they lived, or felt, or suffered, or hoped for something better. The people who control places like this understand something important about power. They understand that real power is the power to control what people remember, and we have no power here. None of the things that power usually comes from. No money, no land, no law, no weapons. But we do have this. We have what we have seen. We have what we know. And if we can find a way to make what we know survive beyond the moment when those who wish to destroy it have their chance to do so, then we will have done something meaningful. Not everything, not nearly enough, but something that matters." This passage, sometimes called by historians the Declaration, changes the way everything before and after it in the diary is understood. The diary was not simply a record of daily life. It was the central document of a careful project created by R, together with several other people on and around the Belmont plantation. Their goal was to create a lasting account of what truly happened there, an account that the powerful people at Belmont would never even know existed. And in fact, they did not know it existed. Not for more than 70 years. The year 1852 brought changes to Belmont that Edmund Hargrove wrote about in his journal with his usual calm and careful tone, recorded those same months with such detail that the two accounts almost feel like they describe completely different realities. In Edmund's journal, there is a note in March saying that the cotton harvest for the year looked promising. In April, he writes about a fence on the eastern edge of the property that needed fixing. In May, he mentions attending a barbecue, a nearby plantation called the Fentress Place, 6 miles to the south, where he and Catherine spent a pleasant evening. In June, he records that a field hand had run away and had not been captured again. In July, he writes about the oppressive summer heat. In R's diary, those same months feel dense and intense, filled with so much quiet tension that they are almost impossible to read quickly. The man who ran away in June, whom R calls Calvin, was not simply someone who suddenly decided to leave. R writes about many weeks of preparation that led to that moment. The slow gathering of information about routes and safe contacts, and the exact set of conditions that made June the right moment rather than May or July. She does not exactly celebrate his escape. Instead, she writes about it with a quiet and controlled sadness. The sadness of someone who knows that every person who escapes makes life slightly more dangerous for those who remain behind, while also understanding that the person who left had every right in the world to go. Calvin is gone, she writes. I hope he has gone very far. I hope he has found the people waiting for him in the places we talked about. I hope he is already somewhere that looks nothing like this place. And I hope, I pray, I hope with everything I have that no one in this house understands enough about what happened for it to return to the ones who are still here. We were careful. We were as careful as anyone could possibly be. But careful is never quite enough in a place that has eyes watching from every corner. And some of those eyes belong to people who will use what they see to try to make themselves safer by putting someone else in greater danger. That is how a place like this survives. That is one of the things Rook understood very well and built his control upon, and something we have always had to work around. It is also something that keeps me from sleeping as peacefully as I should. She was right that they had been careful. Calvin was never captured again. Edmund's journal records his disappearance in a single line and never mentions him again. But something inside the household changed in the weeks after Calvin escaped. R notices it clearly in her entries, a change in Rook's behavior. A new kind of watchfulness that was different from his usual habit of watching everything. He was searching for something, not for Calvin, who was already gone and almost certainly gone forever. He was searching for how Calvin had managed to leave. He wanted to understand the structure behind the escape. He wanted to know who else knew. Rook entered the house 3 times this week, with no clear reason. R writes in July 1852, he does not need to be inside the house. He has no real business here. He comes in because he wants to see us. He watches the way we behave when we believe no one is watching, which is very different from how we behave when we know we are being observed. That difference is information, and information is what he lives for. I have been very still. I have been so very still. Thomas has been still. Dia has been still. We are all practiced in stillness, but I am watching him while he watches us, and I believe he has something. Not everything. Not enough to act upon yet, but something. A suspicion. The kind of feeling a man like him gets when something he built has been moved without his permission. The summer of 1852 passed under this constant pressure, a quiet, invisible tension that none of the official records would ever show to an ordinary reader, but which are records carefully entry after entry, like someone measuring a temperature that continues rising without quite reaching boiling point. Just when we think we understand what Belmont truly is, Rook begins moving closer to the truth. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with someone who enjoys dark history. Press the like button to help the channel continue telling stories like this, and remember to subscribe so you will be here when the next story arrives. Now let us see what Rook actually discovered. Rook discovered something in August of 1852. R writes about it with a calm steadiness that must have taken enormous strength to maintain while writing. She begins the entry almost like a medical report, as if describing events that happened to someone else, rather than to herself. Then halfway through, the control slips just slightly in a way that is more unsettling than any emotional outburst could have been. What Rook discovered was a piece of paper. A folded sheet hidden inside a loose floorboard in the building that served as a gathering place in the quarters. It was not hidden so carefully that a determined search would fail to find it, but it was hidden well enough that a casual glance would easily miss it. On that paper were written several names and what appeared to be a route. A line of notes about distances and landmarks that could only mean one thing. It was not our writing, R says. It was not written by anyone she knew closely. Or if it was, it had been written by someone she had deliberately been kept distant from for exactly this reason, so that what any single person knew would only reach so far. The paper is missing, she writes. Rook discovered it on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday evening, Mr. Harrove already knew, and by Wednesday the man they believed had written it, a man named George, who worked in the South Fields and had never, as far as I know, been part of any of it, was being questioned in a way I will not describe fully, but that I could hear from inside the house, and that made Dia move to the far corner of the kitchen and remain there with her hands pressed flat against the wall until it finally ended. I do not believe George wrote that paper. I think George had nothing at all to do with any of it, and was simply the person Rook chose to believe had written it, which is a very different thing from actually writing it. But there is no real difference between those two things in a place like this. Not when a man like Rook is the one making the decision. George did not confess. Records this with a painful accuracy. He did not confess, and after several days, Rook stopped pushing him, and Edmund wrote a single short line in his journal. Matter resolved in a satisfactory manner. No further action required, and the surface of Belmont returned to looking the way it had always looked. But R knew that the surface had grown thinner now. Rook did not stop, she writes, in September 1852. He only stopped looking in the obvious places. He began searching in the less obvious ones. He is patient in the way a man becomes patient when he knows the answer exists somewhere and is ready to wait for it. I have met very few people in my life who frightened me in a clear intellectual way. Rook is one of them. He frightens me, not because of what he does, but because of how he thinks, and what he is thinking right now. What I can see him thinking in the way he looks at all of us one by one, each time he walks through the house, is this thought. One of you stands at the center of something I can sense but cannot see, and I am going to find you. The relationship between R and Catherine Harrove reaches its most complicated and important point in the autumn of 1852. Catherine had over the previous months continued the quiet and indirect conversations with R that R had first noted beginning in the year before. These conversations had slowly grown into something more open, although R continues to describe them briefly, never writing down exactly what words were spoken. What becomes clear from the diary is that by October of 1852, Catherine knew far more about what was happening at Belmont than her husband did, and that some part of what she knew had come directly from R. I have told her certain things. R writes in late October, I have selected what to tell her carefully. The way medicine is given, not everything at once, because too much at once becomes its own kind of harm. I told her about the things Rook has done that Mr. Hargrove does not know about, or has chosen not to know about, which is almost the same thing. I told her about George. I told her some things about Nance, carefully choosing words that would make her understand without forcing me to say them plainly. She listened to everything and she did not speak for a long time. And then she said, "What do you want me to do?" And I looked at her and thought about that question for a long moment. And I said, "I want you to see it. I want it to be real for you. I want you to not be able to say later, when everything is finished, and the time comes to answer for things that you did not know, because you do know. You have known for some time now, and what you choose to do with that knowledge is the thing that will decide what kind of woman you were." This exchange, R.'s description of it, is one of the passages that historians have studied the most from the diary. The question of what Catherine did with what she knew becomes central to the second half of the story, and the answer is complicated, incomplete, and finally uncertain in ways that make the diary's last sections some of the most haunting and unresolved in any document from the antebellum period. What is clear is that Catherine acted. What remains debated, and what R herself seems unsure about in her later entries, is whether what Catherine did was brave or practical. or something in between that cannot easily be named. In November of 1852, Catherine Hargrove did something that for a woman of her class and time was very unusual. She asked to examine the plantation records, not the cotton ledgers, which Edmund kept separately and discussed with his factor in Vicksburg. She asked to review the domestic records. The records of the people who worked in and around the house, their duties, their movements, the different transactions and arrangements that Brooke was expected to record in a monthly report to Edmund. She said, when Edmund asked why, that she felt the domestic operations of the house had become somewhat disordered since the change in overseer, and she wanted to be certain that everything was being properly handled. It was the sort of request that a planter's wife could make without completely crossing the line, although it was unusual enough that Edmund, according to R., looked at her for a long moment before finally agreeing. What Catherine discovered in those records, or rather what she discovered missing from them, R describes with exact detail. There were gaps. There were people whose work appeared on certain days and disappeared on other days, without any note of illness or reassignment. There were transactions, purchases from Port Gibson, payments made to various parties that appeared in the ledger but did not appear in the plantation account book. There were dates when Rook had clearly been somewhere else, a fact recorded by his own notes of his whereabouts, but on those same days events that he had told Edmund he supervised had supposedly taken place. Mrs. Harrove came to me in the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon. R writes, and she placed the ledger on the table in front of me and pointed to 3 separate entries and said, "These cannot be correct." And I looked at what she was pointing to and I said, "No, ma'am, they are not correct." And she looked at me for a moment and said, "You already knew?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, for a long time." And she said, "How long?" And I said, "Since almost the beginning." This conversation, if R's description of it is accurate, and historians have generally considered her reliable in her recorded claims, became the turning point. It was the moment when Catherine stopped living in the uncertain space of not fully knowing and moved into the space of knowing and having to decide what that knowledge required from her. What it required, she apparently decided, was a letter. The letter that Catherine Harrove wrote in November 1852 is one of the most important documents connected to the Belmont Diary, and it is also one of the most frustrating because it does not survive. R describes it but did not see it directly. She knows about it through what Catherine told her, and Catherine, according to R, described it in the careful and limited way people describe things they have done that they are not completely sure were right. The letter was written to Catherine's father, a man named Thomas Leland, who lived in Natchez, and was a man of some wealth and influence in Mississippi. Catherine's relationship with her father was, by R's account, careful and complicated. She had great respect for him, some degree of fear, and the kind of long-developed understanding of who he was, and what he was capable of that women who grow up, learning how to manage powerful men, often develop. She did not, R says, tell her father everything. She was careful about that. What she told him was something about irregularities in the plantation records, and something about concerns she had begun to develop about Denton Rook, and a general sense of unease about the management of Belmont, which she framed in the most acceptable terms possible, not as a question of justice or human rights, none of which she could have spoken about to her father without being immediately dismissed, but as a matter of property, order, and the smooth running of an enterprise in which her own children's inheritance was involved. She told me what she wrote, our records, or at least the outline of it, and I listened, and I thought, she is very intelligent, and she is doing what she can, and what she can do is not very much, and whether it will be enough is something we will not know for some time. But it is something, and something in a place like this, in a moment like this, is not nothing. Thomas Leland answered the letter in December 1852. R does not have the text of his reply, but she records Catherine's reaction to that reply, the particular expression on Catherine's face when she came to tell R that her father would be coming to visit Belmont in January. She looked the way a person looks, R writes, when they have set something in motion and are not fully certain which direction it will travel. She came to me in the kitchen early in the morning before anyone else was awake, and she said, "My father is coming." And I said, "Good." And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and we did not say anything else for a moment, and that moment, somehow, felt like the most honest thing we had ever shared. Thomas Leland arrived at Belmont on January 14, 1853. Edmund recorded his arrival in a single brief sentence. Catherine's father arrived from Natchez to stay for several days, with no clear understanding of the real reason for the visit beyond ordinary family hospitality. What Leland did during his visit are documents carefully, day by day. He was not a warm man by our account. He was quiet in a way that suggested watchfulness more than comfort, and he carried himself like a man used to judging things, people, property, and situations quickly and without much feeling. He walked around the plantation on his Seco, Dent Day, accompanied by Edmund, and asked questions about the cotton work that Edmund answered easily, like a man who had nothing to hide when it came to production. On the third day, Leland asked to meet Denton Rook. R watched this meeting from an angle she describes with careful detail. She was moving through the hall near the study door, slowly but with intention, in that practiced way that allows a person to be present without seeming to be present at all. The meeting lasted, she estimates, about 45 minutes. She could not hear all of it. What she did hear was Leland asking questions in a quiet, steady voice, and Rook answering in his usual calm manner. Then toward the end, in a moment she records, because the quality of the sound changed somehow, the texture of it, Leland asked something that made Rook's voice rise slightly when he answered. Then Leland said something very quietly that she could not make out, and then silence. I did not see Rook's face when he left the study, she writes. I was not in a position to see it, but I saw him in the yard an hour later, and he had an expression I had not seen on him before. It was small, just a tightening around the eyes and the mouth, but it was there. Something Leland had said had landed. Something had reached him, in a way. Other things had not. I do not know what Leland told him or showed him. I do not know what Catherine's letter said exactly, but something changed in that room. Something shifted. Leland stayed at Belmont for 8 days. He left on January 22nd, saying farewell to Edmund with every appearance of friendliness. He said goodbye to Catherine on the gallery of the big house. The fraged is from inside through the narrow slats of a shutter. He held his daughter's hand for a moment longer than simple courtesy would require. He looked at her. He did not say much. She did not say much either. And then he was in the carriage, and the carriage moved down the avenue of oaks, and she stood on the gallery watching it go until it was out of sight. Then she came inside and walked past me without stopping and went upstairs. I heard her door close. I stood very still and I thought, now we wait. Denton Rook left Belmont in February of 1853. Edmund's journal records this in 4 words. Rook has given notice. There is no further remark, no explanation, no sign of curiosity about the reason, no note about whether he tried to keep Rook or found his leaving inconvenient. 4 words, as if it were completely ordinary for an overseer to leave in the middle of winter, in the middle of the busy preparation time for spring planting. Ara's entry on the same day is much longer. He is gone. She begins. Then she writes nothing for a full line, a blank space, as if she needed to sit with that fact for a moment before continuing. He is gone. He left this morning without ceremony, without the kind of departure that would draw attention or demand it. He loaded his things into a wagon and drove down the avenue of oaks, and I watched him go from the 2nd floor window. I watched until I could not see him anymore. Then I kept watching a little longer just to be certain. After that, I sat down on the floor of the upstairs hall and leaned my head against the wall and stayed there for a long time. I do not know exactly what Leland did. I do not know what Leland said or showed, or threatened or arranged. I know that a man like Leland has resources and connections, and an understanding of how to apply pressure in the places that matter, and I know that something was applied because Rook is gone. That is all I know. That is enough. But I also know this. Rook being gone does not repair what he did. It does not undo any of it. It does not bring back what was taken. It does not change what this place is at its foundation, what it has always been. It only means that one particular form of a particular horror is no longer present. The horror itself is not gone. The horror is the land and the law, and the way things are arranged, and the fact that a man like Rook could come here and do what he did, and then leave in a wagon on a February morning and go somewhere else, then do it again, because nothing, not Leland, not Catherine, not any of it, had the power or the structure or the will to actually stop him from going somewhere else. He is gone from here. He is not gone from the world. And that is the part I must find a way to live with. This passage, and the several that follow in the days after Rook's departure, show R at her most direct about the structure of the world she was living inside. She understood with a clarity that is sometimes breathtaking to read that removing one individual, however important, was not a solution to anything fundamental. She celebrated Rook's departure for exactly one entry. Then she returned to the work. The diary continues for 4 more years after Rook's departure, running through 1857. These years are quieter, not because Belmont became peaceful or fair, but because the particular sharp danger that Rook had represented was no longer there. Edmund hired a new overseer, a man named Jarvis, who R describes briefly and without the deep dread that fills her entries about Rook. He is what he appears to be, she writes, which is either the clearest praise or the clearest criticism, depending on what you already know about the place. Probably both. What the later years of the diary record, and what makes them in some ways the most remarkable part of the whole document, is the steady continuation of the project R described in her declaration of March 1852. She kept writing. She recorded names. She recorded dates. She recorded dates. She recorded events carefully and with attention to the details that mattered. Not the events Edmund would record, the cotton prices and the weather, but the events beneath those events, the births and deaths, and separations and arrivals, and the quiet acts of resistance and connection that formed the real life of Belmont's enslaved community. She recorded the people who left, the ones who ran away, the ones who were sold, the ones who died, and the ones who somehow managed to endure. She recorded them with respect for their individuality, their names, their relationships, the things that made them human. This respect is completely missing from the plantation ledger, where Edmund listed them only as property. She recorded Thomas's steady growth into a man in his 40s, a man who had built over the years a kind of quiet authority in both the house and the quarters that even Jarvis seemed to notice and step around without openly acknowledging. She recorded Delaya's continued presence in the kitchen year after year, an anchor of stability. She recorded Nye's passage into adulthood with careful attention to the way she survived and the particular strength that surviving requires. I have been keeping this record for 5 years now, R writes in an entry from sometime in 1856. The year is written but not the month, one of the few entries without a full date. I have been keeping it hidden and careful, and I have been thinking for a long time about what will happen to it after me, because I am not young anymore. I have been in this house since I was a child, and I have watched everyone around me grow older. I look in the glass and see a woman who is aging as well, and I understand that there will come a time when I am no longer here to keep this safe. I have been thinking about that. I have been planning for it. The book must survive after me. What is written in this book must survive. The entries that follow suggest that by the mid-1850s R had developed a plan for the long-term protection of the diary, a plan that involved at least one other person, someone she describes only as the one who will carry it, with such careful vagueness that historians have never been able to identify who this person was. What she describes is essentially an agreement, a promise, a responsibility that if R died or if the diary was discovered, the document would be removed from the house and hidden or carried somewhere that she believed it could survive. The false panel in the study wall where workers in 1923 finally found it may have been this hiding place. Or it may not have been. R describes the hiding place in her final entries only in an indirect way, a place in the house that the house does not know about, which is either a practical description or something close to poetry. And in any case, it is exactly what happened. The most remarkable entry in Edmund Hurrov's side of the diary, the one that caused the most discussion when historians published their analysis of the document in 1948, appears in April of 1854. It is not long. It is not dramatic. It is simply a paragraph placed between a note about fence repairs and a comment about unusually dry spring weather. And yet it sits in the diary like a stone dropped into say, "Till water, sending ripples outward." I find myself thinking, Edmund wrote, that there is a great deal happening on this place that I do not see. I have always known this in some abstract way. There is always more than a man can observe directly, and one must rely on the reports of others. But lately I have felt more strongly than before that what is unseen is not simply more of what I see, but something different, something organized. I cannot say what has given me this impression. Possibly nothing. Possibly I am only feeling the general burden of responsibility and imagining ghosts. But I walk through this house sometimes and feel that the rooms are fuller than they appear, that the people in them know more than they say, that something is happening here in the corners I cannot reach, and that it has been happening for a long time. This is the only moment in Edmund's journal where he comes close to recognizing the reality of Belmont as R experienced and recorded it. It is partial and vague, buried between ordinary entries. It never leads to anything. He does not follow the feeling, does not ask questions, does not change his behavior in any recorded way. He writes it down, and then writes about the weather. But it is there. He felt it. The thing he had built his life on not seeing, he felt it once in the rooms of his own house, and wrote it down. And R, who read everything he wrote, read that too. Her response in the same diary, the entry immediately after his, is 2 sentences. He felt it. Good. By 1856, Belmont was operating the way prosperous plantations in Claiborne County often operated, efficiently and quietly, producing the cotton and the revenue that made it appear from the outside exactly as it was expected to be. Edmund was in his early 40s, in reasonable health, carrying out his business and social life with the steady routine of a man whose life had settled into the path it was always meant to follow. Catherine was in her late 30s, managing the house and raising their surviving children. Harlan, now 16, and Adelaide 14. The county around them had settled into antebellum prosperity, with church spires, brick storefronts, and a careful civic order. Beneath this surface, R continued watching everything. She recorded in 1856 something she notes. She had known for about a year, but had been unsure whether to write down. A set of observations about Harlan Hurrov, Edmund's son, that she describes with particular care. The boy is not his father, she writes, in ways both better and worse. He is not his father. He has Edmund's intelligence, but not Edmund's habit of deliberate blindness. He sees things. He has been seeing things for years. I noticed this when he was small, the way he watches, the way he moves through this house, and the yard, and the quarters with his eyes open in a way his father's are not. I do not yet know what he will do with what he sees. He is 16, and the world is teaching him the lessons it teaches the sons of men like Edmund. Most of those lessons end with a young man deciding that what he sees is simply how things are, and therefore not worth questioning. But I watch him. He has not made that decision yet, and I am not certain he will. The entries about Harlan continue from time to time through 1856 and 1857. They record something remarkable, a series of encounters, always indirect and never fully spoken, between R and Edmund's son, in which something passed between them without ever quite being said. He helped Thomas carry a load of wood into the house, Residus in September 1856, and he did not speak about it. And Thomas also did not mention anything. But when Jarvis noticed and began to say something, Harlan looked at him in a certain way. Not angry, not harsh, just a very steady and clear look, and Jarvis stopped. He is 16 years old, And he stopped Jarvis with only a look. He does not yet know exactly what he is becoming. He is still feeling his way toward what kind of man he might grow into. But that look, I have been thinking about that look for many days. The last entry in R's part of the diary is dated September 7th, 1857. It is not a dramatic entry. It does not announce anything important. It does not announce anything important. It does not give the feeling of a woman who knew this would be her final entry. There is no sense of ending, no summary, no farewell message. It reads like the continuation of a daily habit that simply, after this date, stopped. Another good morning, she begins, which is strangely the same way she begins the entry. The light came in sideways across the kitchen floor, and Delia made coffee that tasted better than yesterday's. Thomas came in early and repaired the hinge on the kitchen door that has been crooked for a month. Nance is well. Peace and word through the usual method that things are steady. She then writes about a number of small household matters. That things are steady. She then writes about a number of small household matters. A repair needed in one of the upstairs rooms, a question about the winter supplies, and a note about one of the children in the quarters, who had been sick, and now seemed to be recovering. She writes about these things with the careful attention of a woman for whom the daily details of the people around her are not small things at all, but instead the very substance of everything. I have been thinking, she writes in the second half of the entry, about what this book truly is. Not in the abstract way I have sometimes considered it before, the purpose and declaration of it, but in a plain and simple way. What exactly is it? It is a record of a place. It is a record of people. It is a record of what I witnessed. It is a record written in the only way I could write it, hidden inside another man's record, of the same place, which itself becomes a kind of argument, a kind of proof that two completely different truths can exist in the same space, and that the one on the outside, the one with the name on the cover, is not the real truth of what is there. The other one, the one written in the margins, the one underneath, the one written in the margins, the one underneath, the one written in a different hand, that is the truth, not the entire truth. Because no single document can contain the entire truth, and I know that well. But it is a true record, an honest one that refused to look away. I am going to place this book in a place where it will remain safe, she continues, and I am going to trust that it survives. And I will trust that whoever reads it, whenever they read it, however many years later that might be, will understand what they are holding, not just the words, but the weight of the words, what it cost to write them, and what it cost to keep them. A great deal was taken from the people in this place, a great deal. The names that were changed, the families that were separated, the children who were moved away, the choices that were taken from them, and the years that were used for other people's profit. I cannot return any of that. I could not return it from inside this house with this pen and this diary. What I could do was refuse to allow it to be erased. I could write it down. I did write it down. It is here. My name is not on this book. My name is R, and R is enough. And whoever you are reading this, in whatever time you are reading this, in whatever time you are reading it, I want you to understand something. We were here, and we knew everything, and we kept it. And now you know it too. The entry ends there. After a blank line, Edmund's journal continues for another 8 pages. Cotton prices, weather notes, and a short mention of a fence, written in his careful and formal handwriting, completely unaware of the fact that the last entry in the same book had just been written by someone who had been reading his words for more than a decade. The two voices share the same pages, and never once speak to each other directly. That silence, that careful and deliberate,